Welcome back. When we left off, we were talking about the oral tradition of sharing the oral stories of the gospel from AD 32 up to the mid AD 60s when all the first generation, when all the first generation was passing, they realized that they needed to write things down. And so what they do, they set out to write the gospels, and it was either Mark or Matthew that did so first. Today, the consensus seems to be that Mark wrote the first gospel, but you can make a very good argument that Matthew was the first gospel, right? If Mark is the first gospel, then Matthew uses its material plus other sources to write a longer gospel, right? The gospel according to Matthew. Or if you think about this, if Matthew writes the first gospel, right, directed towards a Jewish audience, then Mark uses relevant material from Matthew to craft his gospel for a predominantly Gentile audience. Right? You can make an argument go either way because there's really no textual evidence to support either one being the first gospel. Right? It's simply a matter of making an informed decision as a textual critic and a scholar on which one comes first. Right? And to give a very real example on the difficulty of this, how difficult it is to try to determine which one came first. So one of the very popular critical commentaries on the Gospel according to Mark is called the Anchor Bible Series, and the Gospel of Mark is penned by C.S. Mann. The commentary on the Gospel of Mark is penned by C.S. Mann, and it's about 800 pages long in this Gospel of Mark. And when C.S. Mann began that work, he was quite certain that Mark was the first gospel and began writing from that position. But halfway through the book, from doing research, he changed his mind and had to go back and redo the whole first half of the book because he changed his mind in the process of doing that critical analysis. And so I say this, that the pendulum tends to swing back and forth. But whether it was Mark or Matthew, one of them gets written down, and it gets written down based upon those oral stories about the miracles and about the relationships and all the other things that we talked about previously that Jesus did. And so they write them down, right? They get written down, and let's just say for our purposes that Mark writes the first gospel. Well, Mark is a Jew. Right? He is the son of a woman named Mary. And remember, we meet Mary, right, the mother of Mark, in the Acts of the Apostles. Right? She was a disciple. She was a follower of Jesus. And we can make a very good argument that it was Mary's house where Jesus and the disciples ate their Last Supper. Later on, her home, right, the upper room of that home will become a safe house. It become a place for the people of Jerusalem when trouble breaks out, right? When trouble breaks out for the Christians in Jerusalem. Right? Remember when Peter was arrested by Herod, and he was placed in prison, and he was going to be executed the next day, but then the angel breaks him out of prison that night. Well, where does he go? He goes to the home of Mary, the mother of Mark. Right? And all the other apostles are there praying. And so Peter knows where to go. He knows to go there. It is a known place, right? In times of trouble, that is the safe house where we gather, right? Mary, the mother of Mark, this young fellow. And we know this also that Mark travels with his relative Barnabas and Paul on their first missionary journey. And so Barnabas and Mary, right, the mother of Mark, are related, right? And he travels with Paul and Barnabas, and later Mark will travel with Peter, and he will be in Rome with Peter when Peter gets there, and Peter is in prison there, right? And he hears Peter teach in Rome, and he knows the people in Rome. Well, if we are about in the mid-60s AD now, and Peter has been arrested and he's sentenced to death, and Paul is arrested and sentenced to death, and Mark knows about these fellows quite well. He travels with Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. He travels with Peter, and he stays with Peter in Rome and knows the people in Rome. So if Mark is the first gospel writer, then he writes his gospel under distress to a predominantly Gentile people in Rome. And how do you know that it's a predominantly Gentile audience? Because in Mark, when he mentions holidays like Passover, parenthetically, he defines what it is. Now, you wouldn't have to do that if it was addressed to a Jewish audience, but you would with a Gentile audience. And so Mark is addressed primarily to a Gentile audience. So Mark writes his gospel, and the gospel, according to Mark, is the shortest of the gospels. In fact, Mark is 11,022 words long in the Greek. And Mark has a very unique prose style, right? Mark begins his gospel not with a genealogy like Matthew, right? A genealogy from Abraham to David to the Babylonian captivity to Christ, right? Think about this. That would have no meaning whatsoever to a Gentile audience, but it would have profound meaning to a Jewish audience. And so Mark doesn't do that, right? Mark doesn't use it because he is writing to a Gentile audience. But Mark begins fast in a primarily Greek style of writing called grammatically and anarthrous construction. Let me say again, anarthrous construction. And he says in Mark chapter 1, in Mark verse 1, it begins this way. It says, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. And on he goes at a very fast pace. And that is the Gospel of Mark, right? 11,022 words in the Greek. And in the Gospel of Mark, he uses the word and, right? A-N-D, 1,084 times, right? That is 1 out of every 10 words is this word and. And he uses the word immediately 48 times, right? Compare that with the Gospel of Luke, right? A much longer Gospel, 19,165 words long. Luke uses that word immediately only once. And so think about this. In Mark, the cumulative effects of and immediately, right? It makes that prose style just race across the screen. In Mark, he also uses a technique called historical present tense. That is, he is speaking in the past like a little boy on a playground coming home after school. And saying, Mom, you won't believe what happened today. We were playing in the playground this morning, right? Past tense. And Johnny hits a ball and it goes through the principal's window, right? Shifting to present tense. What does that do? It creates urgency in the story. And so with all the ands, and the immediately, all right, and this use of historical present tense, Mark creates that sense of urgency. Right? Mark is a fast-moving gospel with a very urgent message. Or to be honest, it is my favorite gospel to read. Right? And unlike the other gospels, when we come to the end of Mark, right, in chapter 16 and at verse 6, right, after the resurrection, remember this, the women were at the tomb and the angel spoke to them. And remember what it said in verse 6? The angel said, don't be alarmed. He said, you are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Verse 8, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's the end of the story. That's how the Gospel of Mark ends. Now, we do have additional verses, and in your Bible, you should have a note at those verses 9 through 20, that these verses are not in the most reliable manuscripts, right? They were added later in a totally different prose style. It is a totally different person writing those last verses. Why? Well, most likely a scribe was copying the manuscript and he gets to the end and he's writing down, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And then he's looking for the next page because, well, what about Jesus appearing in an upper room or about all the other stuff in the story? And so that last part is added from another source, presumably because the scribe thinks that he is missing a page. And so it is added on to finish out the story. But it is not part of the architecture of the gospel according to Mark itself. Now, the question is, why then does it end on such an abrupt note? Right? They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Well, think about this. If Mark is the first gospel written, right, and it's written in the mid-60s to an audience in Rome where there is a major persecution going on, if you are a Christian, right, and you may very well be executed. And so how many people in that situation are going to stand up on the deck of life and say, yes, I'm a Christian? Most likely you would be afraid because it might cost you your life. And Mark is saying, yes, we were afraid too. Right there at the empty tomb, right? The women came, right? Not the men. Why? Because the men weren't hiding. But right there, the women came. The women came, and the angel said, go and tell the disciples. And so they said nothing to anyone because they were terrified. Mark is saying, yes, we were terrified, but there comes a time in life when you have to stand up and be counted, no matter the cost. And that is the message of Mark, right? It is the urgency of the gospel, right? The urgency to stand up and be counted, right? That is the message of Mark, right? The pro-style that creates the urgency that amplifies the message. And so it is brilliantly crafted. It is a brilliantly crafted gospel message. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Because of the length of this teaching, we have divided it up into parts. But don't worry, you can catch the next part by clicking on the link on the end screen or clicking on the link in the description below. But before we go, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet and show us some love by clicking on the like button. God bless, and we will see you in the next part of our teaching.